The press release already went out, Naomi. It's done. My father-in-law slid his phone across the boardroom table, the headline already live. Family restaurant group sold to a national chain. Reporters were waiting outside. What he didn't know was that the actual sale required my signature. And I hadn't given it, and I never would. Hey everyone! Glad you're back for another one? And if this is the first time you're finding this channel, welcome, because this particular story still makes my hands shake a little every time I tell it. My name is Naomi Castellano, and for 9 years I've run the day-to-day operations of a regional restaurant group called Castellano Table, 6 locations across the Philadelphia area that my husband's family built starting 3 decades ago. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in that boardroom, but I need to back up first because the moment on that phone screen only makes sense once you understand exactly how we got there. My husband Marco and I met when I was hired as a general manager at their flagship location, and within 2 years I'd been promoted to overseeing all 6 restaurants, not because I married into the family, but because I was the one who actually turned around 2 locations that were bleeding money before I ever started dating Marco's father's business partner's daughter, which is a whole separate story I won't get into here. When Marco's father, Salvatore, decided to restructure ownership 5 years ago for tax and succession reasons, he split the company into preferred and common shares. And because I was the one who'd rebuilt the operational side of the business almost single-handedly, Salvatore insisted, over his own siblings' objections, that I be granted controlling preferred shares alongside Marco, specifically so no major decision, like a sale, could happen without my direct sign-off. At the time, I genuinely thought it was a formality, a legal technicality nobody would ever actually need to invoke. I was wrong about that, and thankfully so. Salvatore's health started declining about 18 months ago, and that's when his younger brother, Dominic, who had always resented not having a larger stake in the company, started positioning himself as the person who should guide the family through this transition. Dominic never had operational involvement in the restaurants. He'd mostly stayed on the investment side of things, but he had a very particular talent for making himself sound essential in family meetings, always speaking in terms of protecting the family's legacy, while conveniently never mentioning that a national chain had approached him directly twice, with acquisition offers he'd quietly been entertaining without telling Salvatore or Marco. I found out about those conversations almost by accident. When our head accountant mentioned that Dominic had requested detailed financial statements for an outside advisor he wouldn't name, I didn't say anything to Marco right away, mostly because Salvatore was going through chemotherapy at the time, and the last thing our family needed was an internal war while he was fighting for his life. But I quietly asked our corporate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Charlotte Higgins, to review exactly what authority Dominic actually had within the company structure, because something about his sudden confidence felt like it was building towards something specific. Charlotte confirmed what I'd hoped was true, that Dominic, despite being on the board, held only common shares with no controlling authority whatsoever, meaning any sale of the company legally required sign-off from both preferred shareholders, which was Marco and me, full stop. Regardless of what Salvatore's health situation looked like, or what Dominic wanted the family to believe about who was guiding anything. About 4 months ago, Salvatore's condition worsened significantly, and Dominic used that window while Marco was traveling back and forth to be with his father, and I was covering both the restaurants and managing Salvatore's care schedule, to quietly accelerate conversations with that national chain. I found out because one of our regional managers mentioned, entirely innocently, that someone from the acquiring company's real estate team had already visited 2 of our locations to assess the properties, a level of activity that doesn't happen during preliminary conversations, that happens when someone believes a deal is already close to signed. I called Charlotte again that same afternoon, and together we quietly pulled every document Dominic had circulated internally over the previous 2 months, and what we found was that he'd been representing to the acquiring company, in writing, that he held authority to negotiate on behalf of the full ownership group, a claim that was flatly false and, depending on how far it had gone, potentially opened him up to real legal exposure of his own. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's the part that actually matters. I didn't tell Marco everything I knew right away, and I've thought a lot about whether that was the right call. His father was dying. He was exhausted, grieving in advance in that specific way you grieve someone who's still alive but slipping, and I made the decision to handle Dominic quietly myself, rather than add one more crisis to what Marco was already carrying. I asked Charlotte to prepare full documentation of our preferred share authority, formally notarized, and to draft a cease and desist specifically addressing Dominic's misrepresentation to the acquiring company, ready to deploy the exact moment it became necessary, rather than the moment it became convenient for me emotionally. And then, 3 weeks ago, it became necessary because Dominic called an emergency board meeting, told everyone, including Marco, that the deal terms had been finalized, and had a press release drafted and ready to go out that same afternoon, timed, I now believe deliberately, for a week when Salvatore was too weak to attend the meeting himself and object in person. That brings us back to that boardroom, the moment I opened this story with. Dominic slid his phone across the table toward me. The headline already visible on the screen, Family Restaurant Group Sold to a National Chain. Reporters apparently already gathering outside our flagship location for a scheduled announcement he'd arranged without consulting either preferred shareholder. The press release already went out, Naomi, he said, with the exact calm confidence of a man who genuinely believed the paperwork side of things was a formality he could clean up afterward. It's done. Marco sat beside me, jaw tight, saying nothing yet, because I think some part of him was still hoping his uncle wouldn't actually go this far while his father was in a hospital bed 20 minutes away. I looked at that phone screen for a moment longer than I needed to, and then I looked up at Dominic and told him, as calmly as I could manage, that the sale wasn't done at all, because it legally required my signature as a controlling preferred shareholder, and I hadn't given it. And based on everything Charlotte and I had spent the last 3 weeks documenting, I had no intention of ever giving it to this particular deal. Dominic's expression shifted. That specific transition from certainty to recalculation, and he told me, somewhat dismissively, that he'd assumed Marco's shares would be sufficient since we were married and presumably aligned on major decisions. I told him that assumption was exactly the problem, that Marco and I were each individually required to sign off separately, precisely because Salvatore had structured it that way 5 years earlier to prevent exactly this kind of situation, a single family member steamrolling a major decision while the person actually running daily operations had no say in it. I then told the room evenly that I had a formally notarized document from Charlotte's office confirming our controlling share authority, dated 3 weeks prior specifically because we'd anticipated this exact scenario, and that I also had documentation showing Dominic had represented false negotiating authority to the acquiring company in writing, a misrepresentation that, depending on how the buyer chose to respond, could expose him to liability entirely separate from anything happening. Inside our own family, the room went completely silent in that particular way rooms go. Silent when the person who thought they held all the leverage suddenly realizes they don't hold any at all. Marco finally spoke, quietly, asking his uncle directly whether he'd actually told the acquiring company he had full authority to negotiate. Dominic didn't answer that question directly, which told everyone in that room everything they needed to know without him saying another word. I called Charlotte from the boardroom that same hour, and by the end of the day, a formal retraction had gone out correcting the earlier press release, along with a cease and desist addressing Dominic's misrepresentation, sent directly to both the acquiring company's legal team and Dominic himself. The acquiring company, understandably uncomfortable once. They realized the negotiation they'd been conducting was built on a lie about who actually held authority. Quietly withdrew their offer within the week rather than risk the legal complications Dominic had exposed them to. Salvatore passed away 2 months later, and I'm grateful, genuinely grateful, that he got to spend his final weeks knowing the business he'd spent 30 years building hadn't been sold out from under him by his own brother, while he was too sick to stop it. Dominic still sits on the board technically, but his role has been formally restructured to remove any external negotiating authority whatsoever, a condition Marco insisted on once his father passed and the estate was settled, and the two of them barely speak now outside of required board meetings. Castellano Table remains fully family-owned, all 6 locations, and I'm still running operations exactly the way I have for the past 9 years, except now there's a much clearer, much more explicit governance document sitting in Charlotte's office specifying precisely who has to sign off on what. Because I never want another family member finding a loophole to exploit, while the rest of us are distracted by something as serious as losing a parent. I think about that boardroom sometimes, the phone sliding across the table, the headline already live. And I don't feel angry about it anymore, so much as I feel a quiet kind of gratitude that I paid close enough attention, quietly, for months, before anyone realized I was paying attention at all. If you'd been sitting in that boardroom watching someone slide you a phone with a headline announcing your own company already sold without your signature, would you have stayed as calm as I did, or would you have reacted differently in the moment? Tell me honestly down in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. And if this story kept you watching until the very end, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another one coming soon about the people who assume a signature is just a formality until the exact moment it isn't.